Hello, Cole here from Storytelling with Data. Today, I'd like to share the best simple tip that I have received in my career. I think it's one that you are going to be able to put to use as well. Let me put that into context with a story. So we have to imagine ourselves back in time. This is when I was working at Google and I had developed and was starting to teach a 2-hour course on data visualization. Now, I developed this originally for part of a training program that we were rolling out, but then we started to get interest in it more broadly. And so had decided that we were going to roll it out across the company, which meant I was going to have the opportunity to travel to offices around the world and teach Googlers how to visualize data. So as part of this, I had the opportunity to attend a Train the Trainer program. This was run internally at Google. It was over the course of a few weeks, part-time on top of my day job, where we learned about things like adult learners and the nuances of trying to teach adults. And we recorded ourselves and used that to refine how we presented and facilitated, and basically did a lot of things to learn how to teach. And at the end of that, one of the facilitators of that program sat in one of my classes, observed me, and offered feedback. And I can still remember the setting. It was your typical conference room setup. Large rectangular table in the middle. I was seated on one end of the table with my laptop in front of me, which I was using to drive the slides. The slides were projected on a screen on the opposite end of the table. And there were about a dozen or so people seated on either side. So I went through my training, felt like I was doing a pretty good job, and we get done. And Neve was the facilitator who was there offering feedback. And she turned to me and she said, "That was great, but I feel a bit like I've been watching a tennis match because I knew my attention needed to be on the slides. You were showing things that I needed to pay attention to, but you at the other end of that table were so animated that I couldn't help but look at you." And what this created was tension, where the entire time she's going back and forth and back and forth. And what Neve said to me, this is where the advice comes in. 2 simple words: stand up, move to the front of the room. And those 2 simple words forever changed the way I present. If I think of the career advice I've received over time, I think those 2 words had both the biggest immediate and lasting impact, because a couple of things happened when I did that. So first off, when I was standing up with my slides, it meant no longer were we working against each other. We weren't competing for attention or clashing. Rather, we were working in coordination, in concert. Second, and this is something I in no way anticipated, but there was something about just the physical motion of standing up that allowed me to take on a different persona, where no longer was I introvert Cole behind my laptop. Standing up, I was now the persona of presenting Cole. And I was able to project this confidence that I eventually, through time and practice, grew into and believed. So today, I want to do a couple of things. My biggest goal is to teach you to appreciate and think about trying to harness the power of standing up when you communicate in a daily meeting setting. I'm going to do this in 3 steps. So start off by talking a little bit more about the benefits of standing up, right? Why should we want to do this in the first place? Then I want to spend time talking about how we can build your comfort for doing so. Give you some specific tactics to try. And then finally, I've solicited some questions related to this ahead of time. So we'll spend a little bit of time going through those as well. So with that in mind, let's chat for a bit about the benefits. Talked about a couple of those aspects already, but there are more. And I think one of those is simply the level of authority, the level of control you get when you stand up. And this has to do with your position physically in space relative to your audience. When you stand up, and everyone else is seated, now there's nothing obstructing your voice or your face. Everyone can see you, can hear you, and it just commands attention in a different way. And I think this plays into that persona shift that I felt happen when I first started standing. Also, when you're standing, it means you can move about the space. And this can help in really useful ways. I think both from the standpoint of making sure everyone is involved or feels addressed. As you move around the room, you can look at different people, you can draw them into the conversation or the discussion. Also, this can be useful for deterring some undesired behaviors. For example, if you see someone pull out their phone, you can walk over to near where that person is sitting. You don't need to look at them or do anything special, simply standing there and continuing to speak. What that person will feel is all the eyes in the room shift toward them, and your voice standing, projecting nearby, that person's going to put down their phone, no questions asked. So being able to move about the space can give you the ability to do some really interesting things. And then finally, when you're standing, as I mentioned, everyone can see your face, which also means you can see everyone else's, which means you can pay attention to expressions and body language. Now, when you first start standing up, you won't have the mind share for this because your brain is going to be thinking about things like, where do I stand? What do I do with my hands? How much should I move? But once you develop comfort here, what happens is you'll find you have some mind share that frees up. And you can use that to be fully present in the moment, to observe what's happening and react to that. So when you see positive body language, people are leaning in, they're smiling, you can see understanding, maybe agreement on their faces or in their gestures. You can see how you might do more of what inspired that. Or if you see furrowed brows or some standoffish body language, you might ask about that or dig into it or shift how you're doing things, or again, where you are in the room in ways that can be really interesting. It's basically real-time data that you can get as you are communicating that you can then respond to and try to redirect in some really interesting ways. All right, so there's a little bit more on the benefits of standing up. Let's chat about how we get comfortable doing so. And so I'll just start off by saying that if you are in an environment where standing up is not the norm, it will feel uncomfortable. I actually like that. I think when we are trying to push ourselves outside of our comfort zones, that can be productive discomfort when we are doing it with a goal and purpose in mind, which would be the case here. That said, there are some ways that we can make it feel less uncomfortable. And so one tip when it comes to that is just start out in a low risk, friendly environment where you can even call out and say, hey, folks, today I'm going to try something a little different. Today I'm going to stand up. I've been wanting to try this out. I think this is a good opportunity to do so. Afterwards, feel free to give me feedback. Let me know how that felt. And so good settings for this would be a weekly team meeting, or if you have a less formal project update, this could be some times to test that out. Visiting where you'll be ahead of time, the actual physical space, can be very useful. Now, I always do this before a presentation from stage, where I'll make sure that I can get into that room ahead of time. I'll stand on stage. I'll understand where the chairs are oriented so that I know where people will be. I can see if there are going to be anything obstructing me, which might change where or how I move. I'll practice moving and standing on stage. I'll also walk the perimeter of the room so that I can see things from the vantage point of everyone who is going to be sitting there, which can help me make adjustments on where I stand and how I move as well. You can do this same thing in a meeting room, in a conference room. If we imagine that conference room that I described at the onset, I might go there ahead of time and just walk around the edge of the room and decide where there's enough space for me to stand, think about my content and when it's useful for both me and my content, my slides, for example, to be visible at the same time, versus when attention could be fully on me. It doesn't need to be on the slides. And then I might use that as a time to walk to a different part of the room. Now, if that still feels uncomfortable, finding, or I guess even planting ways to do that. So when you get to the room ahead of time, you might say, all right, I'm going to get there early so that I can sit up front because that's going to position me close to where my slides are. And then there's a time in my presentation where I know I'm going to want to introduce this graph. So I'll put it on the screen and then I can physically stand up and gesture to different parts of it as I talk through it. So it gives you a purpose for standing up. And then once you do that, you can stand, figure out how long you might hang out standing before potentially going back to your seat. You can do something similar by positioning yourself in a different area than a whiteboard or a flip chart, where even if it doesn't make sense to draw something, you could stand up and there might be an important topic or concept or question that you could just write out in words. And again, this gets you to a different part of the room. It gets you standing and with a purpose in mind versus just randomly standing up, which can feel a little awkward, but also isn't as awkward as you think it is. You can also think about when during a meeting might that level of authority and control that we talked about be useful. For example, if everyone's just getting into the room, things are about to get started, people are chatting because maybe they're not together very often, and you want to get things going, that could be a point to actually roll back your chair. Practice this ahead of time so you don't trip over it as you do so, right? Try to be graceful, where you stand up and say, all right, folks, let's get going today. We have a lot to cover. I want to make sure we have time to get through it. And standing up gets their attention. It also just gets your posture into something that's conducive to having a strong voice and breathing and being able to deliver adeptly. So think about that. Try it out. We have some questions, as I mentioned, related to this that we sought ahead of time. One of those questions is, should you ask for permission to stand or just do it? I'd say I'm mostly a fan of just doing it because, as I mentioned before, it's going to feel more awkward to you than it's likely going to feel to anyone else. And when it comes to calling attention to it, it's kind of like calling attention to technical difficulties. I am not a big fan of doing that because if you experience some sort of technical difficulty, then either people are fully aware and there's no need to remind them of it, or maybe they didn't even notice, in which case there's no reason to bring it to their attention. So I would say, unless it's going to be so countercultural that it just seems crazy and you want to get the elephant out of the room by calling it out, or if it's in one of those friendly scenarios where you're going to be asking people for feedback, then you could draw attention to it. Otherwise, I would say just look for a point and a way to gracefully stand up and just do it for a bit. And it absolutely is one of those things that the more you do, the more comfortable you will become and the more nuanced you can be in how you integrate that as just another tool when it comes to how you communicate. Another question, how do you keep from pacing? This is a great question. And pacing is definitely something we want to avoid. So you don't want to look like you are meandering or haphazardly going back and forth in front of a room. This is not a good feeling. It can actually cause distress on the part of others in the room. So one thing you can think about is you find your positions in the room, and then you can move to one, but then you want to stick there for a bit. Make a few statements, engage people whom you can connect with visually in your sort of near vicinity as makes sense. And then once you've done that for a couple of minutes, then you maybe move on to a different part of the room. Most of what you want to make sure is that you're not missing or nobody's feeling unaddressed or ignored as you are talking through. But it doesn't mean you have to move around to every inch of the space. Picking a couple of spots in opposite parts of the room or opposite sides of a room is usually enough to be able to move about in a little bit, but not have this pacing feel. And actually, when it comes to that, when it comes to a lot of the things that we've talked about today, recording yourself can be an excellent way to gauge whether you are doing things enough, but not too much. When it comes to that, I'll point your attention to episode 1 in the Storytelling with Cole series that goes into practical ways to record yourself and how to review that back to be able to identify specific modifications to make that will improve the way that you present. Another question, this one was from Miriam. How does this apply to virtual presentations? So I would say when you are presenting virtually, you can also consider whether it makes sense to stand. Now, nobody on the other side of that is going to know you're standing. For example, I am standing right now. It changes, as I mentioned, my posture, which can change the level of energy that I bring to the presentation. That can be useful even if people don't see you or you're minimized in size, because it does good things to your voice. It also means I have more room to be able to use my hands if I want to. And that's another one of those things you want to maybe do enough, but not too much so it doesn't become distracting. In virtual land, though, you also want to make use of the space. And that's basically one of the things that we're trying to do when we stand in real life, is be able to move around that three-dimensional space. When it's virtual land, the space we have to use is that space to our sides, let's say that's the side, and in front of us. So being aware of where you are within your camera, making sure you are visible, especially your face, you are lit so that people can see you, and that you know if you are using hands and gestures, how much space and where they have to be in order for that to work. Again, recording yourself can be useful there. We also have a couple versions of the final presentation from the Storytelling with You book. That's the culmination of the case study that's built throughout. One of those delivered in a meeting room and another one that's done virtually, which is a great way to compare and contrast not only the delivery aspect, but also how the visuals were modified for those two modes of delivery. How do you manage PowerPoint notes so that it doesn't seem like you are reading when presenting? This is a great question. And you have to be careful because there is a desire, if you are using speaker notes in your slideware application, to write out word for word what you are going to say. And there is not really a great way to subsequently read all of that without it looking like you're reading and sounding like you're reading. And so I'm a fan, when it comes to speaker notes, of just having keywords or phrases that you can't not hit, the things that you have to remember, because then you've got those to be able to maybe let your eyes bounce to here and there, but you are being present, you are presenting, you are communicating in the spaces in between. So they're a helpful assistant, but they're not replacing your brain when it comes to what you want to say. And like anything, it's a skill that takes practice in figuring out how how much do you put where it's not too much, but it's enough so that you're not either forgetting important things or glossing over something that deserves more time or more explanation. Another thing you can think about is actually building your slides to help reinforce and prompt some of those things as well. For example, if I know there's an important point that I keep forgetting and I'm afraid I'm going to forget it, I can build maybe an animation or something into my slide so that that doesn't get lost. All right, one final question here, and then I'll just remind those watching, if you have questions related to anything that we've talked about today or presenting in general, please leave a comment with your questions. We'll make sure that we monitor those and answer them all. Final question here is, how can I reduce my filler words? This is something that I think probably everyone struggles with. Being aware is the best way to reduce them. I think being aware of what your crutches are when it comes to which filler words you use, when it comes to when you use them, because that will help you understand what you might do instead. And again, recording can be very useful here and listening back to understand this. Oftentimes, filler words creep in when you are trying to think of the next thing you wanted to say. And so we make a statement and then we, and spit the word out. Contrast that with if I make the statement and then I pause until that word or a suitable replacement enters my brain. The first iteration of that sounds like I don't know what I'm talking about. The pause makes me sound thoughtful and can actually command even greater attention and respect. So oftentimes the way to curb filler words is to be aware of what they are when you use them and integrate pauses instead. Also, making other people in your world aware of them so they can point it out when you do. It's super annoying, but can be helpful as well. So with that, I'm going to leave you with two final words. I bet you can guess what they are. Stand up. Next time you present, do this. I wish you very much success when you do. Let me know how it goes. Leave a comment below. I'll see you next time. Thanks for tuning in.